I provide, first of all, some general instruction. These are things that you already know, but probably is better to recall the general setup of this conference. The speakers and the public take part to this conference both in presence and in remote, and further public can follow the conference in streaming. It is important to recall that the conference will be recorded, and the speakers, as well as those who ask questions, are asked to sign the authorization for the recording. The speakers will have 30 minutes for their presentations and are kindly asked to stay within this available time. After each presentation, there are 10 minutes that can be used for questions and comments. I know that some questions came also during the previous session, and apologize for not being able to include these questions in the program, but questions were not foreseen for the greetings of the authorities. Please keep those questions for the following speakers, because we are going to have enough time for this activity. Question and comment should be as short as possible, and the questions that come from the audience, those who ask the questions should introduce themselves to make aware the others about who is speaking. Each session is followed by a chair who will call the speaker and take the questions from the audience, as well as a co-chair who will sit in the back and read the question that come through the chat of Zoom. I hope that the conference will be interesting, and pass the word to the next question, which is chaired by Professor Gregory Stephanopoulos from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Dr. Maria Cristina Facchini, Director of the Institute of Atmospheric Science and Climate of the Italian National Research Council, will act as a co-chair. I leave the floor to them.
Thank you, Bruno. My name is Greg Stephanopoulos, and I'll be chairing the next session. As we all know, a strong consensus is being built in accepting that there is climate change and the causes are mostly anthropogenic. However, there are still many unanswered questions. And there are people who dispute the fact that there is climate change, and many of them have legitimate questions to ask. And I think that these questions need to be settled by scientific analysis. So this is the subject of the first session of this conference. The title is, as you see, Settled and Unsettled Aspects of the Carbon Cycle. And of course, when we think of carbon cycle, we should be thinking about the carbon cycle in terrestrial systems and in oceans. The first talk of this session is supposed to be addressing the issue of carbon cycle in terrestrial systems. We have not received word from the speaker, Dr. Philippe is here, but we may hear from him within the next 30 minutes, so we are going to change the order of the talks. And we are going to proceed with the second speaker, Dr. Andy Watson. Dr. Watson is an Earth system scientist at the University of Exeter. He has interest in processes impacting the concentration of carbon dioxide and how this is affecting climate. Has made many contributions in different areas including effects of climate in other planets. Also, he has interests in paleoclimatology, astrobiology, but his main interest is in carbon cycle in terrestrial systems, of course, and how this is impacted by human activity. He was elected at the Royal Society in 2003 for his work on the use of tracers in understanding the mixing in oceans and also the effect of nutrients like iron in the growth of plankton. And he's going to speak today on the subject of the ocean sink for atmospheric carbon dioxide, what we know and what we don't.
My mask, I hope. Good morning, everybody, here and online, I guess. It is a great honor to be asked to talk here today on the subject of the carbon cycle in the oceans. And I very much echo the comments in the first session this morning about the importance of this work, and in particular at this moment trying to ensure that our leaders are, as they come up to the COP26, to the G20 in Italy, that they are aware of the consensus that we are building in the climate change among climate change scientists. So I'm going to talk today particularly about the oceans, the ocean sink for CO2, what we know and what we don't. And I first have to give thanks and acknowledgement to the people that have helped me in putting this talk together and in the work that I'm going to describe. So Jamie Schuttler, colleagues from the University of Exeter, Jamie Schuttler, Ute Schuster, Elena Kozlova, and Dorothy Backer from the University of East Anglia, Peter Landschütze from MPI Meteorology in Hamburg, Ralph Keeling and Manfredi Menitzer and Eric Morgan from Scripps Institution, and Martin Hyman from the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry. So all of these people have helped me with this talk. So just a quick summary, first of all, about the ocean, about the carbon cycle as a whole, in particular the anthropogenic carbon cycle, that is to say, the carbon dioxide that we're releasing into the atmosphere, where it's coming from, and what happens to it. Currently, we are releasing somewhat over 10 petagrams of carbon, which is more than 44 petagrams of CO2 to the atmosphere every year, most of it by fossil fuel burning, and a smaller contribution due to land use change, to deforestation and movement towards replacement of natural systems by agriculture. Of this CO2 released, slightly under half at the moment remains in the atmosphere. That is what is causing the atmospheric CO2 to rise at about 2 parts per million per year. A substantial proportion of the rest goes into the land biota. So the terrestrial carbon cycle is putting on carbon. It's growing as a result of being fertilized by the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, also possibly, probably by the release of fixed nitrogen into the environment. And a substantial proportion also goes into the ocean, and that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about here. So how do we know these figures? This is a a graphic that's produced by my colleagues in the Global Carbon Project. The way that it works is we have the sources up here and the sinks down here, and they match one another at any time. And for the sinks, we know quite well how much is going into the atmosphere because we can measure it accurately in the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is well mixed, so a relatively small number of measurements can give you the total. The fossil fuel, we also know well, within about 10%, maybe better, how much fossil fuel we are burning and therefore how much carbon we're releasing. Let me go through that. We have poor estimates of how much deforestation is occurring and how much CO2 as a result is being released by land use change. Up until now, the uptake by the ocean has mostly been modeled, and it shows a relatively smooth increase over time. And that leaves the remainder of the budget is traditionally how the amount going into land vegetation has been worked out. Now this is changing. The Global Carbon Project is now beginning to use models to work out this number too. And they would like to use data to work out the ocean uptake, so I'll be talking about that. When they do that, of course, the budget doesn't quite balance anymore, but it gets close. So, turning now to the ocean sink, how do we define how much carbon dioxide is going into the ocean? As I say, the main way to do this up until this point has been using models. I'll talk a bit more about those in a second. And there are a number of observational methods which give also constraints or estimates, which I will go through. Firstly, a word then on ocean carbon models. These have been developed, well, right back into the 50s and 60s. There were box models which were calibrated by the bomb, the nuclear bomb release of carbon-14. But today, these models are general circulation models of the ocean. They are relatively sophisticated, although the ones that are used for carbon models are still relatively low resolution. They will also have a simple representation of the marine ecosystem in them, usually simple. They're often referred to as NPZD or NPZD. They got some nutrients, some plankton, phytoplankton, some zooplankton, and some detritus. So it's a really rather simplified system. And it turns out that in these models, most of the anthropogenic uptake of CO2 is determined by the physics of the overturning of how water gets from the surface into the deeper ocean. So subduction, overturning processes, which are in some respects the more difficult parts of the physical system to work, but the models are relatively successful at that. So here's a look at some of the results of those models run over the last, or since 1985 up to the present day, more or less. And what you see is that they show an increasing sink. This is the rate at which CO2 is going into the ocean, and it's increasing with time. The models all agree, but in general, they show yearly and decadal variability, but they don't, there are 8 models here, and they don't show the same interannual or in decadal variability. So they don't really have much coherence. So this is the mean of the models. The fact that they don't agree, well, they agree in the multi-decadal trend, but they do not agree in the, but they don't agree in on shorter time scales, basically. So that's been the principal mechanism at this point by which we have tried to get a handle on the ocean carbon sink, at least in global budgets. There are observational methods, and I want to say a bit about those. The first of these is the use of atmospheric measurements of the oxygen, actually the ratio of oxygen to nitrogen in the atmosphere. This gives a constraint on specifically actually the ocean sink. The way that this works, this was first demonstrated by Ralph Keeling back in around 1990 as part of his PhD project. And he's been working on this ever since. Essentially, fossil fuel burning consumes atmospheric carbon dioxide. So the oxygen content of the atmosphere is slowly declining as the atmospheric content of CO2 goes up. When carbon dioxide is absorbed by the ocean, there is no change in the oxygen content of the atmosphere. But when it's taken up by the land biota, they do so by net photosynthesis, so they produce oxygen. So if you measure the rate at which carbon dioxide is decreasing and the rate at which, increasing, and the rate at which oxygen is decreasing, you have 2 relationships, and you can use those 2 relationships to solve for your 2 unknowns, which are the rate at which the ocean is taking up carbon dioxide and the net rate at which the land is taking up carbon dioxide. That's the net rate at which the land takes up CO2, so it's the growth of the biosphere minus the rate of deforestation. So that's Keeling's method, and today there are several, some dozens of stations around the world where atmospheric oxygen is measured. And this is the result of, I would tend to say these are rather preliminary results. I haven't actually shown these before in a conference. These are the results for the oxygen sink for the Scripps Institution network and the Max Planck network set up by Martin Hyman from Jena over 5-year intervals for the ocean sink for CO2. And it suggests that the ocean sink was constant or possibly declining in the 1990s, and that since that time it has been steadily increasing, maybe more rapidly increasing recently. There's caveats on this, and the gray bars show you some of the uncertainties. The uncertainties come about because when you measure the rate of decline of oxygen in the atmosphere, it varies both in time and in space around the planet. So the atmosphere is not well. One has to average over at least 5-year periods to get good numbers from this, and so there still remain some uncertainties on that. Another method of getting at the amount of carbon dioxide that goes into the ocean is to use measurements at the surface of the ocean of the partial pressure of CO2, PCO2. And that has been measured since the late 60s, early 70s, from research ships, from ships of opportunity, from more recently from commercial vessels and at fixed stations. And in the last decade or so, that database has been brought together and quality controlled by a huge voluntary effort by the scientists involved, and into what is called the Surface Ocean CO2 Atlas. And this picture is all of the, it just shows all of the measurements that have been made. So one can use this measurement of PCO2 at the surface ocean in combination with atmospheric CO2 and measurements of the gas exchange rate to get at the flux that's going into the ocean. And the coverage looks good when you look like this, but actually it's comparatively sparse if you look at finer time details, and it's also quite vulnerable to change. So here I show what the measurements that were in the North Atlantic in 2018, which was quite good coverage, and then several of the countries that were doing this stopped doing it, and so since that time we've not had very much data from the North Atlantic, which is nevertheless the best observed ocean in the world. And down here I show the measurements in the Southern Ocean, all of the measurements in the wintertime Southern Ocean between 2000 and 2018, and you can see there are very few. So the coverage is actually not by itself good enough to get very good estimates. So what we have been doing over the last decade or so is to use regressions or increasingly machine learning techniques trained on this data to construct mappings of the surface PCO2, which we can extrapolate over the entirety of the surface. And so this uses satellite data for sea surface temperature, sea surface salinity, winds, data on mixed layer depths, data on chlorophyll, etc. And that enables us to expand these data and do the calculation over the whole surface of the ocean. So there are now several estimates based on this method, and here are 3 of them. And again, the thick line is the average of those methods. And again, these do show this tendency. So if I put them the average together with the atmospheric data, you can see there's some coherence here. We see that the ocean sink apparently was steady or maybe declining slightly in the 1990s, and since that time, it's rapidly increased. That's what this methodology seems to show. There's also other techniques to try and get at how much CO2 is going into the ocean. There is methods to reconstruct the inventory of carbon in the ocean, which use data from research cruises that have from the 1970s onwards that have been measuring carbon parameters and also nutrients, CFCs in the oceans. And there are various techniques of using these data that can be used to reconstruct the inventory of carbon, and the rate at which that inventory is increasing is the flux of carbon into the ocean. So this is the sort of picture that you get when you look at where this anthropogenic carbon is currently situated in the ocean. Much of it, the North Atlantic stands out as a hot spot because that's the region where a large amount of deep water is formed, and as that deep water is formed, water coming from the surface into the deeper ocean brings carbon dioxide with it into the ocean. But actually, the largest amount is occurring in the Southern Ocean, in the subantarctic region of the Southern Ocean, which is much bigger than the North Atlantic. So there's more CO2 going into that region altogether. Now, this methodology enables us to get at how much there is there. It's not so good at telling us, you know, in any given year how much has gone in, but it provides a kind of check on the integrated input into the ocean. There are issues with these observational techniques, which we have not yet worked out fully. One is that the different methods of observation are really measuring subtly different quantities. It's actually, in terms of observation, really defining what anthropogenic CO2 is a little bit tricky in the oceans, because one has to know what the pre-industrial content was, and we weren't doing measurements pre-industrially. So, for instance, we believe, we know that there must have been a flux of carbon dioxide. There's a natural flux of CO2 out of the oceans into the atmosphere, and this is part of a loop which then goes into the land biota, down rivers and back into the ocean. And that riverine flux loop is thought to be around 0.5 petagram of carbon a year. And it's a sort of, if you measure the actual flux going through the ocean surface, you need to include that. But if you are doing a model, it's usually not in it. And if you are looking at anthropogenic carbon that's inventory in the ocean, it's not clear whether it's in it or not. So there's some uncertainty there. There's also an uncertainty with this technique for measuring the flux through the surface using surface data, in that traditional treatment of the surface observations ignores small temperature differences very near the surface, which probably means that the measurement that you make with a ship or at a few meters depth is not quite the same as the CO2 that the atmosphere actually sees at the very surface of the planet. So that could be causing, this graph here shows a typical result for global estimates of CO2 flux with time if you don't make those corrections, and then with corrections that you make using satellite data, for example, for that, and you get quite a substantial difference when you do that. So there are some unknowns and things that we still haven't worked out quite there. So in my view then, what comes down to the big issue that we don't know about the ocean sink right now is what causes this decadal variability. We seem to see that it changes, for example, from the 90s to the 2000s and 2010s, that the rate of change of uptake is not closely related to the rate at which atmospheric CO2 is going up, which tends to be what the models basically do. So we hypothesize that most of these decadal changes are due to more or less outgassing of natural carbon, that is to say, the CO2 that is pre-industrially in the ocean. Most, you know, the ocean, of course, is a huge reservoir of carbon, and it naturally is more or less in steady state with the ocean, with the atmosphere, but it can be out of steady state for periods of several decades, maybe periods of hundreds of years. So when when climate change begins to occur, whether that's natural climate change or human-caused climate change, that is going to change this balance of natural carbon, and that will be affected but that will affect the burden of CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's not clear to us at the moment exactly how we deal with this with our observations or our models. This is a comparison of the mean of those models that I showed earlier and the mean of the surface-based estimates of flux. And what you can see is that there's some coherence between these, but for instance, the models do not capture this increased. They're increasingly diverging from the observations, or the observations are increasingly diverging from the models, and whereas the observations show a clear change in the rate of uptake around 2000, the models don't really show that. So there are differences here, and we don't fully understand these. Probable reasons then are that the models have inadequate physics at the present. As I said, they're relatively low resolution, they're non-eddy resolving. You need to do that because we are doing long runs, we have many variables, including all of the carbon variables. So they have probably inadequate eddy-associated vertical transports. They possibly have the wrong diffusion so some problems with the physics, which could be fixed perhaps by going to higher resolution, need bigger computers. And probably also they have, definitely they have completely inadequate ecosystem representation. And we know some of the issues that are with that. In particular, the alkalinity of the ocean is not properly being reproduced in these models. They don't have migration of zooplankton, for example, which may be cause an important variable in the carbon transport. Also, we see that one thing we know is that most variability comes from the Southern Ocean. And so this is from a paper in 2015 by Peter Landschutzer and others. It shows this is our reconstruction of how the flux into the Southern Ocean has changed over this time period. And we can see that it's really quite variable, and it does not follow what you would expect if it was simply increasing slowly as the atmospheric CO2 increased. And this is due most likely to changing wind patterns over the Southern Ocean, particularly an increase in the strength of the circumpolar winds during that period. Future projections then are quite reasonably uncertain. This is, for example, under the RCP 8.5, business as usual type uptake. What this shows is that as atmospheric CO2 continues to increase, at some point in the middle of this century, under this scenario, the uptake of CO2 by the ocean stops increasing. It doesn't stop, but it does stop increasing. It no longer tracks or stays, as it were, in step with the uptake. And that's because the buffer capacity of the ocean simply decreases as you increase atmospheric CO2. This is a consequence of the chemistry, really, of the ocean. So this is actually the Revel factor. The higher the Revel factor, the lower the buffer capacity of the ocean. And under high business as usual scenarios, this declines rapidly in this century. So I think I should skip to my ending, right? I should point out that our observation, it's kind of obvious that we need to continue to observe this, but as I pointed out, those observations are in fact really quite vulnerable. They're not well coordinated. They're not, there's no global carbon ocean observing system at the moment, but there should be. So I'll summarize with what we know, which is roughly that the net anthropogenic sink is currently between 2.5 and 3.8 petagrams of carbon per year with around 90% certainty. The net flux varies decadally. It was relatively constant in the 1990s, has increased rapidly since then. Models that we have at the moment struggle to capture that behavior. Most of the variability is coming from the Southern Ocean. That's what we know. What we don't know would be the real underlying causes of that variability. It's most probably due to the outgassing of natural carbon in response to changing circulation and possibly biology. But what drives this is not at all clear. How will it change in the future depends on the emissions, but also on climate change affecting the ocean circulation and the biology. And will we be able to observe it? At the moment, our observing system is vulnerable and it needs attention and investment. So, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. We have, do we have word from Philippe? No?
Nope.
So we have plenty of time for discussion.
Oh, okay.
And I'm going to begin with the first question. Take my prerogative as a chair to ask the first question. It looks like we are not anywhere near settling many of these questions. And that would be fine with most other scientific questions, but in this case, when countries and nations are contemplating trillions of dollars of investment and drastic changes in lifestyle, don't you think that we need a more sound basis in order to justify that kind of a decision?
Yes, and I've talked about the oceans, which is, I would say, considerably better understood than the land biosphere, which Philippe, I guess, is not going to talk to us. But the land biosphere, frankly, it's much less well understood. It's more variable than the oceans. It varies year to year, not just decade to decade. So, frankly, and I'd like to point out that before 2000 the early 1990s, when atmospheric measurements and ocean measurements showed unequivocally that there must be a land sink for carbon dioxide, most terrestrial ecologists at that time thought that the land would be a source of CO2, not a sink. So the land sink was not even anticipated before, as it were, the modern era of observations. And so we don't understand the land sink at all. We don't understand the ocean sink very well. And I would absolutely say yes. It seems to me that under those circumstances, the only thing that one can do is apply the precautionary principle and say, well, we really need to stop doing this as soon as possible, because we do not know whether these sinks will continue. We do not know for sure whether these sinks are going to continue. In fact, you know, all of the model estimates suggest that both the ocean sink and the land sink decline in efficiency from this point on, as it were, as climate change really begins to take effect.
So is it fair to say that it is more the fear of the unknown than the certainty of the distraction that drives this whole thing?
This is a tricky question, because if you ask, I think that if you ask climate scientists and carbon scientists, about why they are so worried about the future. It's not really because of what the models are saying, what's in the models. It's because they know that the models are not adequate. It's because they know that if you push our current knowledge, too far away from the present, we really don't know what might happen. I think Thomas Stocker may talk more about that, but this is a point that was made by Wally Broker back in the 1980s. We don't understand this system properly, and we don't understand it sufficiently well to make really solid predictions too far into the future. So yeah, I would say, as far as the climate side is concerned, it's actually the fear of the unknown that is really, to some extent. I mean, we have eminent climate scientists here who can disagree, but that's my impression.
Well, my job as a session chair is to create enough controversy so that it fuels more questions on your part. I'm going to stop here and recognize the gentleman, please.
Thank you, Andrew, for that very interesting talk. And I'm not going to fall yet for your bait and address this controversy. It's very interesting and important. But I wanted to ask you a more scientific question. It seems vital, and I think you would agree, to distinguish between what is natural variability in the system and what is force variability. And the natural decadal variability we understand better strictly in the atmosphere-ocean component is essentially chaotic. That is, we may know something about its amplitude and its average period, but we wouldn't be able to forecast it for a long time. If that's the case, and I'm going back to an earlier slide where you had many models, we wouldn't expect the phase of the natural oscillations to be the same, even for the same model, but with different initial conditions. So I guess my question is, if it's chaotic variability, do the individual models have an amplitude that's comparable to your other estimates of the natural variability?
That's a very interesting point. Those models are the Global Carbon Project's models. They are forced with the same, they're supposed to be forced with the same atmospheric forcing, so the same heat fluxes or surface temperatures and winds, etc. And yet they give, so the variability that you see between the models is coming from the, so half of, as it were, of the system has been fixed, and it's only the ocean part that is varying. But yes, there could be, it could be that it's, chaotic variability that is causing those differences. I suspect that it's not. I think it's because they, in detail, they have different circulation. They respond differently to the same forcing, basically. I think that is mostly the explanation. But I would absolutely agree that if you have, certainly the Earth system as a whole has that chaotic variability, and you would have to run, ensembles of them, I guess, to be able to properly compare them. So yeah, it's a component. I suspect it's not the main component in this case.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
That's Roberto Bassi speaking from the National Academy of Science here. My question is, what do you think about the influence of the photosynthetic activity of algae in the fluxes in the oceans? Is it a major component? Is it a component of this variation that you observe in short and medium time?
I think You can do a simple calculation that, that about 90% of the flux that is going from the surface of carbon, for instance, is going from the surface ocean into the deep ocean. 90% of that flux must be going in the dissolved phase. It's not the particulate flux which is mediated by the plankton. So over these decadal time periods, I think that the change in the biota, in photosynthesis, for example, is not having a large effect on what we are seeing right now. That is not to say that it is not incredibly important in the longer time period, because if you run such a model over 100 years or more, then the amount of the partition between the ocean and the atmosphere is very much affected by how effective the plankton are at taking up carbon in the surface layer. So they become more important as you run the model, as you become concerned with longer time intervals, until when you get to glacial, interglacial times, they are actually a dominant component of it. But over these relatively short times of a decade or two, I think the answer is probably they're relatively unimportant, maybe 10%.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, for this great talk, opening this conference. I was wondering, I never heard the word acidification in your talk. I think this is one of the important impacts that the uptake of carbon dioxide to the ocean system actually makes. So that's the first point. The second point, perhaps just a comment and taking the bait that Gregory put out here, as to the question, how much do we really understand to take global action? I should just remind ourselves of a paper that was published in 1978. You know that paper? It was written by Uli Siegenthaler and my predecessor, Hans Oeschger, who at that time made a prediction of the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration in the year 2000. This required a box model of ocean uptake. In other words, some basic understanding of the global scale response of the ocean to an increased carbon dioxide concentration. And already in 1978, it was possible to make a prediction that was within 6%, if we look now at the carbon dioxide concentration in the year 2000, which we've measured. So to me, that was a revelation how much the science has known already 40, 50 years ago. Yeah. That as a comment, but the scientific question, acidification. Thank you, Andy.
Okay. Yes, you're right, Thomas. I didn't talk about acidification because when I was asked to give the talk, they said the ocean sink for CO2, what we know and what we don't. So I have another talk which I can give you. Of course, ocean acidification is a very important topic, and the ocean is doing us a climate service, as it were, by taking up carbon dioxide. It slows the rate of climate change, but it comes at the cost that the surface ocean is becoming, the pH is dropping, and this has a variety of negative effects on marine life, and it's especially on calcifying marine life. That includes all the corals and coral reefs of the world. So it's a very important topic. It's really very closely related, but I just from the pure climate point of view, I thought I wouldn't talk about it, but it's very closely related and very important. And I do agree that there's a surprising amount that was, you know, we have these sophisticated models now with, but much of the basic knowledge about the uptake of traces in general from the atmosphere comes from the overturning circulation, which can be, and it can be done with a box model on the back of an envelope, basically. It's not that hard to do.
Before, can I ask to go ahead with a question? We have from one of our speakers, Timothy Palmer, who is online on the web. If you can, thank you.
Hello, can you hear me, Andy? I don't know. Am I getting through?
Yeah, hello, Tim.
Hi. Yeah. So yeah, apologies. I'm not there in person. I'm looking forward to speaking tomorrow. I had my hand up at the beginning, and my question was slightly diffused actually by Kerry's question, which was very similar to what I was going to ask you. But then I thought maybe I'll ask you a slightly more refined, if you like, version of Kerry's question, which is, presumably it's possible in principle to run the ocean models where you add a sort of an extra relaxation term towards you know, some of the ocean reanalysis products which exist now. When I say relaxation, in terms of the current and the temperatures. So you're just adding the circulation. So you're saying to the ocean, let's more or less tell the ocean what is the correct circulation. But you let the carbon parameterizations run freely, but given that information. I guess my question really is whether, in that situation, whether the carbon models would then be able to emulate some of the decadal variability that you spoke about. In other words, you know, given the circulation, do we get it right with the carbon models, or is this really something that's missing in the inherent carbon chemistry or carbon process physics?
Well, a number of us are doing pretty much that at the moment, in fact. So we are trying to use various types of data assimilation into the ocean models, starting with just the physical variables, and then moving on to trying also to assimilate the biogeochemical variables, so the carbon and the nutrients measurements themselves. And yes, they do improve. I don't think we have an answer yet as to whether you know, whether we can get all of it that way. And it's you know, so for example, there's the Echo version 4, I think now has been used. You know, that's a state estimation. So it doesn't. My understanding of it is that it gets the longer term variability correct. It doesn't necessarily, you know, follow every wrinkle that the data say, but it gets the longer term circulation correct. And we are trying to use that to get better versions and see whether we can get this variability. Yes, so that's an active area of research, and I don't think I have an answer to it yet.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bruno Carli, Accademia dei Lincei. In your talk, Andy, you mentioned that we expect a saturation in the capability of the ocean to absorb CO2. And this is somewhat surprising because the deposit of CO2 in the ocean is much larger than in the atmosphere. And in the long term, with the long time constant, we expect that most of the CO2 will go into the ocean. So this saturation is not a saturation of the capability. Can you tell something more about the chemistry that is behind this saturation?
Yes, this is occurring because we are moving. It's really because the atmospheric CO2 is going up so quickly. So if you raise in the business as usual RCP at 8.5, it's up around 500 parts per million in at some point in the middle of the century, and if you were to allow the ocean, if you were to hold it there and allow the ocean to run, as it were, for 500 years, it would indeed take up much of that CO2, and much of the capability would be restored. But what is happening is that the surface the surface carbonate system is being moved really quite acid, and so one is losing bicarbonate, and it is an increasing amount of the carbon is in the dissolved CO2. In other words, it's losing that buffer capacity. So it's because we're shifting the CO2 near the surface so quickly, basically.
Before Christina, do we have any questions from the chat?
No, we don't have any other question from the chat.
Please go ahead.
Andrea Rinaldo, the Accademia di Lincei. Wonderful talk indeed. It seems that we're not going to have a talk on terrestrial biosphere and the carbon cycle, regretfully. But you mentioned something which is quite interesting, in fact, of the fact that uncertainties therein are much, much larger. Well, I'm actually a hydrologist, and I know the debate is ongoing about the carbon sink. Could you, kind of patch up, you're not supposed to, but could you kind of patch up and tell us more about that?
About that, okay. Yeah. As I say, it was not, so the issue is, why does the land biosphere is it taking up CO2? It is taking it up, my understanding is that that we now think there's two fundamental reasons. One is the fertilization effect of carbon dioxide. So just the fact that CO2 is risen in the atmosphere causes plants to net photosynthesize. At least C3 plants, I guess, are particularly sensitive to that. So if you want to grow, if a market gardener is growing tomatoes, one way of making the tomato plants grow faster is to put a lot of carbon dioxide in your greenhouse, and this stimulates the plants. So it's just a fertilization effect. The other reason is that we are producing, we have also accelerated the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle to a huge extent. We now fix nitrogen from the atmosphere by the Haber-Bosch process, and we use inorganic fertilizer, and we put that on our crops, but it gets washed into other areas too. Motor cars produce and combustion produce odd nitrogen, so it's another way of fixing nitrogen. So we are fertilizing the land biosphere by adding nitrogen and possibly phosphorus as well, which is an agricultural nutrient. So for these two reasons are probably the reasons why we're taking up the land biota is taking up carbon dioxide, but it's also very vulnerable to climate change. So typically in an El Nino year, following the El Nino, there are droughts and floods and in various parts of the world, and the droughts may cause fires, and the fires release CO2 into the atmosphere in sometimes incredibly large quantities. And the floods can also release CO2 into the atmosphere in large quantities. So the land biosphere seems to be much more variable from a year-to-year basis, especially it's vulnerable to the after effects of El Niños and other climate oscillations, I guess. So it seems to be much more variable and vulnerable to change. And it's a struggle to model that. And until, I would say, recently, the models have not been, the Global Carbon Project, for example, has felt that the models were not sufficiently robust to even attempt to use them. So they would simply use the ocean model, and as I say, they would, the land uptake was whatever was left, basically, from the budget. Now they are attempting to use terrestrial biological models, but for example, if you don't have a good fire module in your model, it's not going to work. So there are tremendous challenges there.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Well, I have a question if we want to continue the discussion.
We are going to reconvene at 10:20 after coffee, so let's have another question and then we go to coffee.
Sorry, I was only asking if you really wanted to continue the discussion that you started yourself about that. And I'd just to offer a comment, because we have some time on that, if that's okay. It's not really a question for you, Andrew, but I'd be interested to hear your ideas about it. That is that I don't think there's a robust answer to your conundrum about waiting for model certainty versus acting, but I would phrase it this way. And I would say that it's analogous to the decision tree that a general on a battlefield has to make. No general fighting an important battle has ever said, I have complete information. And so what the general has to do is to weigh the risks of acting on incomplete information versus the risks of waiting for more complete information. I would say if we take that conundrum to the climate problem, and this is my personal opinion, we've long passed the point. And it really is the risks of waiting now, in my mind, completely outweigh the risks, particularly when you consider that there are many reasons to migrate away from fossil fuels besides climate. 8.7 million premature deaths per year from particulates from fossil fuel combustion. So that's my opinion, and I only put that out if you want to have a discussion along these lines. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps I can offer a comment, which is that this is exactly how I frame the problem, that it is an issue on which we have to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. And then essentially we have to calculate expected losses versus the cost. And the expected losses, they have embedded in them the concept of probability. And considering the huge cost associated with inaction, they make for a compelling case. On a compelling case to act, to do something. On the other hand, it is a sophisticated argument which is not easy to penetrate through voters who may be swayed one way or another simply by using scientific arguments. Because voters can be persuaded that there is really no compelling reason to act on that. This issue of probability, etc., I think it's not easy to penetrate to many people and make them act. That's the problem I have. And if they ask, for example, Andrew, directly the question, so do you believe that there is a climate change and we need to do something about that? He cannot give a 5-minute answer. He has to say yes or no. I mean, you're an expert on this. And you're going to be called on this question and you have to provide an answer.
And I find, as we all do, I'm sure, that policymakers they very much want to, very much want to hear from the scientists, but they always want you to be more certain. They always want you to say what you're certain about. Well, you know, but the scientific, the way that we're trained is not to be absolutely certain. We must be open to, you know, that's what you expect in scientific debate. So what ends by happening is that the policymaker and the voter are asking that they want the scientists' views, but the scientists are not properly, you know, we're not skilled in oratory, as it were. What we are skilled at is in the debate, you know, which is meant to get at that old-fashioned notion of truth. And so I feel that, in a sense, I feel that we almost need, you know, to retrain ourselves to have a public face, and then the private face which we use in discussion meetings such as this. Yeah.
If I may ask a question, Andrew, on this, which is connecting actually all of these different topics. You ended up in your last slide by saying that, I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but you provided a 90% certainty on something, and I don't remember what that was. If you can remind us, please.
I gave approximately a 90% uncertainty on the current and sink for CO2 into the oceans. Yeah.
Oh, uncertainty, 90%.
Oh no. Sorry. Currently, I gave a range which I think covers with 90% certainty the sink into the oceans.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there questions from the chat?
Christina is handling that, and she's not seeing anything.
Nothing else.
Okay, it looks like we have exhausted the topic, and there are no other questions. So thank you, Andrew, for standing up there for so long.